why even read fantasy anymore? To answer that question, we have to go back to the start. The first fantasy book was written in— I'm just kidding, it's not that kind of video essay. Fantasy. Not that fantasy. This fantasy. How great is it? It slaps. But in the year 2023, I don't think quite enough people really think about the fact that there has never been more ways to experience the fantasy genre, and not all of it is dog water. There's a lot of obvious reasons that reading fantasy fiction is still great, but in this video I want to take a closer look into some of the alternatives and the reasons that people slow down on the page flipping, and why that's okay. What's shakin'? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. I make lots of videos about fantasy books and stories, so if that's your kind of thing then I would love it if you stuck around. So I mentioned before that there are so many different ways to experience the fantasy genre now, more than at any other point in history. Books, comics, manga, audiobooks, movies, shows, video games, tabletop games, video content like YouTube and TikTok and so on. The best part about there being so many different methods for enjoying fantasy is that each of them are their own different type of experience. The most obvious example I can give of this being a different type of experience is video games versus books. A novel is a more linear story told by the author. You're more of a passenger just on the journey here. Whereas video games are more of an interactive story where progress is determined by the actions of the player. By you. Ultimately, in almost all cases, the video game is still linear, it still has a direction you have to go, but how quickly you get there and what happens along the way is really up to you. Another less on the nose example is books versus audiobooks. Audiobooks are a different experience, even if it's the same story, and that is because so much of the audio experience is the narrator's performance, and make no mistake, it is a performance, if the narrator is good at their job. So, with so many different ways to enjoy fantasy, it can be pretty easy to fall off the reading bandwagon and find yourself beans deep in Diablo 4, rather than keeping up with whatever the newest mega hyped fantasy book is at the time, even if the cover art is so good that it makes you want to bust a nut. You don't need me to tell you it's okay to play games instead of reading. I know. My point is simply that fantasy novels aren't the only way to get a genuinely powerful and impactful story anymore. I actually made a whole video explaining why PlayStation 2's Final Fantasy X is my favorite fantasy story. Like, ever. I think a lot of people, understandably, undersell the impact that fantasy stories in other mediums outside of books can have on you. While it's not a huge group of people that do it, there is a level of gatekeeping in the fantasy community when it comes to putting stories told by video games and movies and shows on the same level as books. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. I've wanted to play Dungeons & Dragons since I was in my early teens, pretty much since I saw that episode of Community, the one that got taken off Disney Plus for that joke.
Just gonna ignore that hate crime, huh?
Since then, I've watched hundreds of hours of D&D content, like Critical Role, but I never had the chance to actually play it myself, mainly because me and my friends just didn't know where to start. Dungeons & Dragons seems like a very complicated and difficult game to get into from the outside, especially with finding a DM, or Dungeon Master for the newbies out there. A Dungeon Master is basically just the person who is leading the story, telling you what is happening. Well, a few months ago I decided to finally roll the dice and give it a go, and since then I have been playing 2 weekly games of D&D, one with a group of people online and the other with my close mates in person. And in regards to fantasy storytelling, here is what I think of D&D so far. It is amazing. There's just no other way to put it. The reason I'm mentioning D&D in this video is because as much as it is a game, and it is a game, I would say the main focus, the main goal for both the players and the DM isn't to win, it's to tell a story. That's why it's called a TTRPG, or tabletop role-playing game. You technically don't have to roleplay, but it's a lot more fun and has a lot more memorable impact if you do. If you don't know too much about D&D, the most brief explanation I can give is that your DM guides you through a story where you and your allies are the main characters. You, the player, make choices, then you roll dice to see if those choices work. A good or a bad roll of the dice can drastically shift the story in a completely new direction, which is then dictated by the Dungeon Master. D&D is unlike all other forms of fantasy storytelling in that it feels completely fluid. The DM can guide players towards a planned out quest, but the players can just as easily go the other way and end up wiping out a village full of friendly NPCs, which is a very fun experience for the for the DMs, right, Dungeon Masters? Weird choices and bad dice rolls can result in some really spectacular and unusual moments, like one that I had last week, where my tiefling fighter ended up having to dangle my old, naked, druid gnome ally over the edge of a bridge with a rope tied around his midsection. It's better if I don't give you the context on that one. Just trust me on that. The world you play in D&D is incredibly alive because it's always changing, and in ways that a lot of the time simply can't be predicted. At the end of the day, you have a fun game, but more than that, it's a few hours of fantasy story that you have personal stakes in. Your choices change the story in a way that even video games can't do. Just on a side note, I've also been 3D printing a lot of miniatures for our D&D sessions, and it is so fun. I actually wouldn't mind getting into painting those miniatures as well. I know that's about as dorky as you can get, but I'm not really giving off tradie at the footy game vibes as it is, so fuck it. So with all these different forms of fantasy storytelling, why do we keep gravitating to such a passive, time-consuming, and frankly expensive hobby like reading? I'm sure you could give me plenty of reasons why you choose to read fantasy fiction, and you should in the comments below, but I'm not going to give you some regurgitated platitudes about escapism. That's usually the answer or response that everyone jumps to. We all want to escape into a fantasy world because the real world is But what I will say is that books, at least for me, have a much more intimate and personal connection between me and the storyteller than things like video games do. When I read the Greenbone Saga, I could feel the absolute and overwhelming passion and emotion that Fonda Lee put into her world and her characters. You can definitely get that vibe from video games. I mentioned just before how video games are quite underrated when it comes to how good they are at storytelling sometimes, but a lot of that intimacy that I'm talking about is then shared between not just the story, but the gameplay mechanics, the graphics, and so on.
What the f*** is this piece of...
When it comes to books, it's just you, the author, and the story that you two are sharing. I think that's why fantasy adaptations generally have such high standards that we expect them to meet. We all have our own personal interpretation for how stories within Middle-earth should be told, and when we end up having to share that vision with large film studios, their cast and their crew, as well as the people watching the show with us physically on the couch next to us, those visions that we all have tend to clash. We wanted a story exploring the ancestry of the Lord of the Rings characters and world that we love so much, and Amazon wanted a half-baked tray of nostalgia bait, I guess. The medium of fantasy storytelling in novel form is so drastically different to anything involving a screen. What novels and TTRPGs share is theater of the mind, meaning that your experience of the story, what you see, is generated entirely within your imagination. The author walks you through what it is you should be imagining, sure, but there's always going to be details that your big beautiful brain will fill in and embellish on, all on its own. Inside your head, there is no bad CGI. Well, there shouldn't be. Now I'm just imagining someone with like CW visual effects in their imagination. I do want to quickly touch on how inaccessible reading fantasy can be for a lot of people. I'm not too sure what the pricing is like where you are, but in Australia, books are exceptionally expensive. For a lot of people here, our only choice is just to cave and send Amazon money for Jeff Bezos's head polish. I get why buying books from brick and mortar stores is the price that it is, why it's so expensive. They have to make money too. I get it. But with that said, $50 or more for one novel just isn't realistic to me. That's like half a week's worth of groceries, and then that book just ends up sitting on the shelf collecting dust for God knows how long. That's generally why I get all of my books by ebook or audiobook now. In regards to storage and my wallet, it's just easier. But I mean, there's also libraries, both digital and physical, which is fantastic. Fantasy books aren't going anywhere, which is good. But I guess the purpose of this video was just to talk about, in the most long-winded way possible, the value and the benefits of experiencing fantasy fiction in different ways. I would love to hear from you what different types of fantasy storytelling you enjoy outside of reading, or why in particular reading fantasy fiction is your favorite way of trekking along with adventurers across fantastical worlds. God, I really love D&D, man. It's just fun. Like, I always thought about like how it looked fun, like when I saw it on TV and stuff. But then there was always like a big part of me that was like, I feel like I'm going to play it and then it's going to be so complicated or like too cringy that I just don't enjoy it. But it's good if you just let yourself go and just enjoy it and get into the role-playing aspect. It's really, really fun. I think one thing I would really like to do one day is get a bunch of like the fantasy booktubers here on YouTube and have them together for like a D&D one-shot live stream. Like a live stream where you just do one quick D&D adventure. I don't know, maybe raise some money for a charity or something on the live stream. I think that would just be fun. I haven't seen anyone within like the fantasy booktube sphere do that before. I think that'd be fun. Anyway, thanks for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. I make lots of videos about fantasy books and stories. If that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. Otherwise, thanks for watching this one. Maybe I'll see you in the next. Catch ya.